Subcommittee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recesses during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. Today we're going to examine the priorities of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and its vision for addressing the challenges the agency faces in meeting its strategic priorities. I want to first welcome our new ranking member, Mr. Katko from New York State. We're delighted to work with you. We also sit together on the Homeland Security Committee, so many of those issues overlap, so I see a lot of opportunities for collaboration. We've met personally, talked about some of our priorities, and we look forward to a great relationship going forward. I also now want to welcome our guest, who is the administrator for the FEMA, Mr. Peter Gaynor, and also a colleague, Mr. Cicilline, who knows Mr. Gaynor and would like to introduce him. So I now recognize Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the ranking member and the chair of the full committee for giving me this opportunity. Mr. Gaynor served as my emergency management director for the city of Providence when I served as mayor from 2008 to 2014. His talent was then identified by our governor, Governor Raimondo, who took him and hired him as the emergency management director for the state of Rhode Island from 2015 to 2018. And he was then named the deputy director of FEMA and ultimately the director of FEMA and confirmed twice by the United States Senate. He served our country for 26 years as a United States Marine, but I can tell you my own personal experience is that as an emergency management professional, he is really spectacular. And in fact, he took the city of Providence, which was a fairly disorganized emergency management operation, and made it the first city in America with an accredited emergency management agency. That's just one example of the extraordinary work that he did and earned the deep respect of all of the partners, both in the city and the state, and someone I know who will continue to carry out this great work ethic and professionalism and dedication to the mission of emergency management. And I learned yesterday that he was testifying before the subcommittee, and I'm really grateful that you're giving me the opportunity to make the introduction. I can say of all the many people I've worked with in my 25 years in public life, Pete Gaynor is at the top of the list in terms of his professionalism, his expertise, his commitment to the public mission of emergency management, and really appreciate the opportunity to share those thoughts with the committee, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. We appreciate that, and we look forward to working with Mr. Gaynor. We are glad now that he's no longer acting. We need that leadership at the head of FEMA, especially during these trying times. Okay. FEMA is supposed to be led by 3 presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed public servants, but here we are with only 1, so there's a lot of responsibility that's falling on your shoulders. Usually we think that it's the Senate's fault that things don't get done, but that's not the case with FEMA. The White House hasn't even nominated anyone to fill the other 2 positions. And this void in management at FEMA has come at a time when we're navigating several major disaster declarations and a pandemic with potentially devastating impacts all across the country. So strong leadership is essential at every level within FEMA. There's also shared concern in this subcommittee that FEMA's workforce is stretched thin, and you note as much in your written testimony. We want to talk more about how we can address that. It's clear we need some solutions to improve recruitment and retention at FEMA so that the agency can effectively respond to the needs of communities in the wake of disasters. It should go without saying that the government must address the needs of all Americans in disaster recovery. However, some of our most vulnerable populations are being neglected or shamefully overlooked by existing FEMA programs. Committee staff have met with advocates from the disability and low-income communities regarding their frustration with FEMA's attention or lack thereof to their needs in times of recovery. After years of progress on this front in response to the failures we saw in Hurricane Katrina, these communities fear that we're backsliding. We'll discuss these issues too, I'm sure, further on in today's hearing. I appreciate how much you have embraced the Disaster Recovery Reform Act and the long-term benefits it will have, not only for the well-being of our people in times of disaster, but for the resilience of our public buildings and private homes. In the wake of disaster, we should be building back better than what existed before. That's why I was proud of the bipartisan work of this committee in passing H.R. 5756, the Resiliency Enhancement Act, co-sponsored by Congresswoman Plaskett of the U.S. Virgin Islands and Congresswoman Gonzalez Colon of Puerto Rico. Finally, I'm certain that members of this committee will be interested in hearing updates on FEMA's involvement in the effort to prevent the spread of the coronavirus in the U.S. I know there are some developments just happening last night and this morning in the Senate, and we'd like to have you address those if this is the time for expanding Stafford to cover corona. At the state, local, tribal, and territorial level, public health officials are working with their emergency management counterparts to boost public preparedness, safety, and education. To date, FEMA has not been part of the coordinated effort to these ends, as it was in 2000 in response to West Nile outbreak, and we'd like to talk about that. So I'll close by saying we certainly recognize the challenges you face, Mr. Administrator, and we're here to help because we want you to be successful in this job. Our communities need for you to be successful in this job. We look forward to working with you. I'll now recognize the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to serve on this committee and this subcommittee. And I want to echo your sentiments that we had a very good meeting before we came in here the last couple of days, talking about how we can proceed in a bipartisan manner. That seems to be the hallmark of this subcommittee, and it's a hallmark of what we do on Homeland Security as well. So I'm quite confident that we're going to be able to work well together and do good things together. We both are blessed with excellent staffers as well on this subcommittee, so I'm excited for what the future brings for us on this subcommittee. And I'm happy to talk to you again, Mr. Gaynor. I want to thank you for coming to my district last year to talk about and look at and survey for yourself some of the disaster issues we have. And when we had those discussions last year, I think you'll recall, and we had them recently again, I voiced some of my concerns about FEMA, not so much how it's managed, but some of the Byzantine rules you have to go through to try and get disaster relief. What is considered as a disaster in upstate New York may pale in comparison to disasters elsewhere, but they're disasters nonetheless. And I want to give you two quick examples. One was Moravia, New York. They had a flash flood after a torrential rain came down, and it basically wiped out the city's or the town's sewer and water systems and roadways and all kinds of damage. For them, it was catastrophic. For FEMA, it was a blip on a screen, and they didn't get any money. Something more severe happened recently that you were up in Lake Ontario for, and that was Plan 2014. That was implemented at the very end of the Obama administration, and it dramatically changed the regulation of water on Lake Ontario and water levels on Lake Ontario for the first time in 70 years. In those ensuing 70 years, lakefront properties were developed, economic vitality became key for those counties on the lakeshore properties. In fact, one of the counties, 50% of their tax revenue comes from lakeshore properties, and they have been devastated 2 out of the last 3 years since Plan 2014 has been implemented. And again, this year, they're expecting catastrophic water levels again, probably worse than the other 2 years. So again, it may not rise to the level of a big disaster for a place like New York City, but it's devastating for people upstate New York. And when you have hundreds of millions of dollars of damages, and then you have to tell your constituents you don't qualify under FEMA, it's very frustrating. So I look forward to talking with you and developing programs that are going to help that. While we're working to get changes to Plan 2014, it's critical we also work to recover and mitigate against future flooding and find ways to help communities outside the major urban areas that may not meet the damage threshold for a federal declaration. Key issues relate to support for preliminary damage assessments and clarifying how severe localized impacts of disasters are considered in the declaration process. Last year, I introduced H.R. 4358, the Preliminary Damage Assessment Improvement Act that would help clarify the support FEMA provides on damage assessments. I hope we can act on that legislation soon on this subcommittee. I also look forward to working with members of this committee on how we can further improve the declaration process for disasters with localized impacts. From a broader standpoint, it's critical for us to focus on how we can approach disaster response and recovery in an innovative and common sense way that makes sense for local communities hit by disasters for the federal taxpayer. I believe it can be done, and I'm confident with your leadership we can get there. I appreciate the progress being made on reforms we enacted in the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. However, as we are learning, more reforms and streamlining are needed to ensure communities can recover faster and smarter. Time is money, and the longer it takes for communities to rebuild, the higher the cost not only for those communities, but also for the federal taxpayer. So it serves no one when recovery drags on. We must find ways to do things differently to help speed up the process, and I'm confident that you're the person to do that. The DRRA was a good step in cutting through some of the red tape, but more is needed. I look forward to hearing from FEMA, from you, Mr. Gaynor, and working with members on the committee on ensuring our emergency management system works effectively for communities preparing for, responding to, and recovering from disasters. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the chairman of the committee, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for holding this hearing. Mr. Administrator, thank you for being here today. Congratulations, I guess, on taking the job and being confirmed. It's a very difficult job, as we all recognize. I took the committee down to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands a few weeks ago, and I, in particular, the FEMA person in the Virgin Islands is very impressive. I guess it's his second tour of duty there, and you know, Puerto Rico's still a work in progress, I think, but I think FEMA's trying to get things on track. I couldn't tell whether some of the problems had to do more with the government of Puerto Rico or what the concern was, but I mean, there's still, you know, I think they were going to finally start doing some housing reconstruction this month, and they say it's going to ramp up quickly. They've still got 24,000 blue tarps there. And then we went over the other side of the island, which is a different story. I mean, not only do they still have hurricane impacts, but the earthquake was quite devastating. You know, for one thing, their schools were the hurricane shelters. Hurricane season's 3 months away, and the schools are collapsed. And most of the public buildings, too, are unusable because they were pretty much all 60s, 70s vintage before, you know, we came up with more modern techniques and realized the extent. One thing, though, and hopefully you'll address that here, is that we still don't have approval for permanent repair assistance. I met with a group of the mayors over in Ponce, but they represent the whole earthquake zone. And you know, that's a concern because the public buildings have to be reconstructed and, well, demolished, then reconstructed, and the schools, and I don't know what exactly is holding that up. And another observation would be people are having trouble with records, again, particularly, you know, property records. And we adopted, after the hurricane, a self-certification document that FEMA used, but it isn't yet being used, or wasn't as of a few weeks ago, in the earthquake zone, and I would hope that we can just dust off that form and get these people the assistance they need more quickly. With that, I look forward to hearing your remarks. And also, I don't know if you'll address this or you may come up in questions, what sort of planning is going on, since FEMA has played a key role historically in coordinating among agencies in you know, SARS and some other things, whether that same role is being played today in the federal government. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Graves, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I also want to thank Administrator Gaynor for being here today, and I also want to thank the Administrator for meeting with me and other members of the committee earlier. You know, ensuring there is ongoing communication it's very helpful for members whose district have obviously been impacted by disasters. FEMA has a lot on its plate, and I know we've got more than 640 open disasters dating back to 2000. With 2017 and 2018 being record years for disasters, we have to find some innovative ways to speed up recovery and get people and communities back on their feet more quickly. Otherwise, FEMA resources are going to continue to be stretched thin, which slows that recovery process even more. But red tape and bureaucratic requirements that may have been intended to save taxpayers' dollars, I think actually cost the taxpayers more. And when FEMA resources are spent to claw back a few $1,000s from an individual who applied for those funds in good faith and may have spent those funds to repair their home, and I think it costs more to collect those funds or claw them back. And it also re-victimizes those disaster victims. And that's why I introduced the bill, the Preventing Disaster Re-Victimization Act, which requires FEMA to waive those debts for victims in instances where the agency was at fault. And I very much appreciate the committee unanimously approving that bill last month. But there's many more examples where current law and in practice, they simply don't make sense. They increase costs and they do slow recovery. And I hope to work with you, Administrator Gaynor, and the other members of the committee on additional reforms to improve this process. There's also a lot more under your portfolio, including preparedness and response. And I hope today we can also hear a little bit about FEMA's unique role with respect to coronavirus. While currently HHS is in the lead, should there need to be a declaration pursuant to the Stafford Act by law, the administrator is going to report and advise the president directly. This requirement in law was a change after Hurricane Katrina to ensure the president is advised directly by the government's emergency management expert. And while we hope such an emergency declaration is not needed, it's important that FEMA is at the table now so that now in case it is needed. And in case that, we just want to make sure that we have a seamless transition to FEMA as that lead agency. But again, I want to thank Administrator Gaynor for being here, and I look forward to your testimony. And with that, I yield back the balance. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'd now like to welcome our witness, the Honorable Peter T. Gaynor, who's the new administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, known as FEMA. We thank you very much for being here today and for meeting with us. We look forward to your testimony. Without objection, the witness's full statement will be included in the record. And since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. So, Mr. Gaynor, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Chairman DeFazio, Chairwoman Titus, ranking members Katko and Graves, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Pete Gaynor, and I'm the FEMA administrator. It is an honor to appear before you today to discuss FEMA's strategic goals that will best serve the American people in 2020 and beyond. Interwoven into our priorities is an understanding that emergency management is about putting people first, both the disaster survivors we serve and the individuals who serve them. The principles within our strategic goals for 2020 were designed with lessons learned from recent historic disasters, which have tested our nation's ability to respond to and recover from multiple concurrent disasters. Recovery from these historic disasters continues today, even as we pivot to prepare for emerging threats facing our homeland. Resiliency is at the heart of America's heritage, and I remain confident that FEMA's ability to respond to any disaster, as well as support the efforts to contain and mitigate COVID-19. Experience has demonstrated that one of the most effective ways to support FEMA's mission is by building a culture of preparedness before disasters take place. Developing resilient communities reduces both loss of life and economic disruption. Every dollar invested in mitigation is estimated to save the American taxpayer $6 in future spending. It is for these reasons that building a culture of preparedness is the first goal within FEMA's strategic plan. As a former emergency manager at the state and local level, I am mindful that all levels of government share a fundamental responsibility for disaster preparedness. In 2020, I'm directing the agency to focus on advancing shared responsibility across FEMA's mission space. One of the most important ways to increase our preparedness for disasters begins with standardized building codes, which are designed to protect lives and property. State, local, tribal, and territorial governments must play a leading role in incorporating and enforcing disaster-resilient designs within our communities. Presently, less than half of U.S. jurisdictions have adopted the latest disaster-resilient building codes. FEMA will also continue to promote shared responsibility of preparedness by implementing the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant Program, also known as BRIC. This year, FEMA was able to make $250 million available through BRIC to support pre-disaster mitigation programs designed to protect community lifelines and build more resilient infrastructure. As we move towards full implementation in October of this year, BRIC will continue to allow for larger and more consistent investments in preparedness. One of the most important considerations for building codes and mitigation projects is the risk of catastrophic flooding. Flooding is the most common and costly natural disaster in the United States. 98% of the counties across the country have experienced a flooding event. Mitigating these risks to protect people and property is not only a moral imperative, it is prudent fiscal policy. The investment in pre-disaster mitigation across the country has resulted in $100 billion in avoided losses over the past 40 years. In 2020, FEMA is focused on ensuring Americans are protected from floodwaters both physically and financially. Flood insurance is the first line of defense. Managing risk through insurance helps families recover faster after disasters and reduces the overall cost for taxpayers by lowering applications for assistance programs. In response to the 2019 flooding season alone, FEMA paid $1.1 billion for 33,000 validated claims. Yet, despite these advantages, only 33% of the people living within the special flood hazard areas carry flood insurance. FEMA hopes to coordinate with Congress to make flood insurance more financially accessible to all Americans to close the insurance gap. But to fully build a culture of preparedness, we must seek to incentivize external partners to proactively adopt better risk management practices by reducing federal support for repetitive post-disaster repairs. FEMA's second goal is to ready the nation for catastrophic disasters. This includes low and no-notice incidents, which can overwhelm governments at all levels and threaten national security. Our nation's readiness largely depends on the emergency management professionals who execute FEMA's mission. I have had the opportunity to see our dedicated employees across the country firsthand, and I believe that we must support FEMA professionals as they support the American people. Therefore, it is vital that we remain laser-focused on supporting our workforce by ensuring that our culture is reflected in our core values. FEMA will continue to ensure expeditious and fair review of allegations of misconduct through our Office of Professional Responsibility. We will also continue to prioritize our workforce and that our workforce and leaders better reflect the diverse nature of our country. The final goal in our strategic plan is to reduce the complexity of FEMA. FEMA must be adaptable to meet the needs of disaster survivors, and we must ensure that assistance programs are accessible by making them easier to navigate. Recovery funds currently come from 17 different federal agencies, and FEMA does not want to burden survivors by adding the complexity of an already intricate system. One of the most effective ways to reduce complexity of emergency management is to reduce the over-reliance on federal government in the first place, and to better empower states and municipalities with the tools they need to manage smaller-scale disasters. We are eager to work closely with Congress to increase this shared responsibility across the nation, whether it's increasing preparedness, readying the nation for catastrophic disasters, or reducing the complexity of FEMA. Increasing the shared responsibility of emergency management at all levels of government is critical to our success. Emergency management works best when it's locally executed, state-managed, and federally supported. I'd like to thank the lawmakers here today for providing FEMA with the resources to build a prepared and more resilient nation, and thank you for the opportunity to testify, and look forward to any questions you may have today.
Thank you, Mr. Administrator, for being here. We appreciate your testimony. We're now going to move on to member questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I'll start by recognizing myself. Administrator Gaynor, you discussed the need to grow and retain your national incident management workforce. We're spending millions of dollars to train these folks, only to see them then leave their jobs. Based on the briefings we've received over the last year, any gains FEMA made in achieving growing its workforce have been offset by relatively equal numbers of people who are leaving. You've been at the agency and at this kind of work for a long time. I wonder if you have some plans, what you're thinking about keeping these public servants from leaving after they learn the skills to deal with disasters, and have you explored seeking similar return to work protections that Americans interested in serving in disasters could have, similar to the National Guard and military reserve. So when they go off to duty, when they come back, they have a guaranteed job, something like that.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for your question. First, I'd like to say that I think I have the greatest workforce in federal government, along with the greatest mission in federal government, helping people before, during, and after disasters. We have been focused on making sure that we attract, recruit the best qualified individuals from across the country to come and join our mission, as well as retain all those great employees that come here to participate in providing disaster assistance to disaster survivors across the country in all sorts of different circumstances. This has been one of my first goals, even as the deputy at FEMA, deputy administrator, and it continues to be my goal today to make sure that we have a diverse, ethical, integrated workforce from the beginning. And so I have a number of different initiatives going on within our mission support branch to focus on retention, retaining, a career path, and again, we put a lot of money and invest a lot of money into our workforce, and it is our number one priority. Without people, it makes it extremely difficult for me to deliver any kind of mission, so this is my first priority.
That's great. We often see pictures and hear stories of heroes during times of disaster, and we hate to lose them or not get them in the first place because they're afraid they'll lose their job, and then what will they go home to?
Yes, ma'am, and for you, Sarah, I think we would love to have a conversation with Congress about moving that forward. Again, a large majority of my workforce are reservists, about 12,000, and these are the people I count on every day to leave their homes, go to the field, and again, provide that disaster assistance to our disaster survivors. So again, a critical part of our workforce.
Well, great. We look forward to working with you on that. My second question, and this is something I noted in the opening statement, is I'm concerned about what appears to be backsliding with FEMA's work with people with disabilities. The Office of Disability Inclusion and Coordination was established a decade ago, but the administration seems to be pulling back in their efforts with the community. The ODIC is absent from the weekly National Disability Stakeholders calls. They're consistently absent in any discussion related to emergency. And the Emergency Preparedness Report released last fall, which guides FEMA's mission, makes zero mention of people with disabilities. Could you speak to these concerns and give some assurances to us, as well as the 61 million Americans who have a disability, that you are not forgetting them and that you do see them and their challenges?
Yes, ma'am. The Office of Disability Integration works directly for me. The director and I have traveled on numerous times to communities to make sure that we are connecting with that community. I have a sister who has a disability, so this is at the top of my priority list, making sure that we serve everyone, to include those with access and functional needs. The office has conducted numerous outreach to dozens of different stakeholders in the community. Wounded Warriors, National Council on Disability, National VOAD, who represents 70 or 80 different volunteer organizations. I believe that our outreach is comprehensive. We also have the ability to send disaster integrated, disability integrated employees to disaster sites to make sure that we're taking care of those disaster survivors who need it the most. I'd be happy to provide you or any member of the committee a brief from my team on all the things that we're doing to improve the connection between disaster services to those with access and functional needs.
Well, I think that would help reassure folks, but also maybe you could direct the Office of Disability to get on those national stakeholder calls, and that would be an improvement as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Now I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. I'm going to kind of give you a fact pattern, and then maybe we can work from that fact pattern because I think it'll be instructive here. I mentioned Plan 2014 in my opening statement, but I just want to kind of give you a couple of examples that have happened. Since Plan 2014 has been implemented, there's been catastrophic flooding on Lake Ontario 2 out of the first 3 years of its implementation. Sodus Bay makes up 50% of the tax revenue for Wayne County, or the shoreline properties, and they've been dramatically affected. And the town of Sodus Bay really is literally going to be underwater this year, and there's multiple restaurants, marinas that are probably going to not survive financially. Same with Fairhaven next door. Greenpoint Marina, for example, been in existence for 115 years, is on the verge of going out of business because they've suffered over $4 million worth of losses and damages from these two flooding acts. You can put your face on this too. Bill and Karen Dunn, they bought a house in 2017 on Lake Ontario that had not had flooding in 90 years. And 2 out of 3 years, our house has been underwater. And they are not wealthy people. And this is going on across the 200 miles of Lake Ontario shoreline. And to date, 0 FEMA funds are going there because of the technical rules, if you will. And I know I've talked about this, and I'm not to accuse you, I'm just saying, I want to know how we can fix this and think about this. And then you add into what happens in those small town disasters, we're really a blip on the screen for FEMA, but for those small towns, they're catastrophic disasters, like I mentioned with Moravia. Now, I know the Disaster Recovery Reform Act directed FEMA to give greater consideration for localized impacts of disasters and declarations. And I know you pushed out some guidance to your regions, but from a practical standpoint, how is localized impact given greater weight? And what are the shortcomings now? What can we do moving forward to try and get a better handle on this? And if it needs legislation, tell me what we need.
Yes, sir. As it reflects to flooding, and whether it's in your district or across the country, really the best defense against flooding is insurance. 1 inch of water is $25,000 in damage. And if I can give you an example from Hurricane Harvey in Houston, we have a couple different programs that we offer in disasters. One of them is individual assistance, and the cap for individual assistance is about $34,900. That's the max you can get. And the other program is NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program. The cap on that is $250,000 for the structure and another $250,000 for the content. So in Harvey, very few people max out in IA, very few. The average IA check that we sent to disaster survivors was about $6,000, average. If you had flood insurance, the average check that you got from the insurance company, NFIP, was about $119,000. And again, the difference is dramatic. Will $6,000 be helpful in a flooding event? Absolutely. But will it help you repair or build your house back? It will be a difficult stretch. But if you had $119,000, it's a good start to getting your life back to normal. So I would just implore everyone, again, this is the insurance gap that I talked about, is flood insurance is your best defense. Average cost for insurance program is about $700 across the nation. And you can get that through your local insurance adjuster. So it doesn't matter.
Does that go up if there's continuous flooding that's evident?
Say that one more time.
Does that go up, the premiums go up if there's continuous flooding of it happening?
Again, I think you would have to call your insurance
Okay, we'll
broker
check
to
that out.
kind of
Okay.
get the details about where you live and what your risk is. I mean, I don't want to give any specifics on it because it is, I think, house by house. But again, essentially, it's the best defense. When it comes to localized impacts, we have a series, 6 things we look at, and we want to give greater weight to localized impacts, but that doesn't necessarily mean greater weight on localized impacts wins every time. I think there's a tension between localized impact and the capacity of a local community or a state or a county.
Okay, applying what you know about Lake Ontario and what's been happening up there, do you foresee possibly seeing a different result than what they've had so far, which is basically nothing?
For an award?
Yes.
Well, again, sir, it's based on damages and eligibility, and we do this, it's called a disaster or a pre-disaster assessment on damages.
I'm getting around out of time, so I just want to interrupt you real quick. There's literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars worth of damages on the shoreline that can be proven, but they don't fall into the FEMA bucket, and that's our concern. That's the point I'm trying to get at.
Yes, sir.
And so what can we do about that?
There's 19 different federal agencies that have probably 90 different disaster programs. I'd be happy to work with you and your staff to see, is there another program other than FEMA that fits into that problem set that we can help with?
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We'll work on that. I now recognize the chairman for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Administrator, I raised the issue of the individual assistance and self-certification, consequent to what I had heard in Puerto Rico, and you had developed this process previously, but it isn't being currently applied for the earthquake victims. So what's the rationale to change back to the more difficult process?
Yes, sir. I was just in Puerto Rico after the new year, and we are using self-certification, the same process that we used in Maria. There was no different. I asked that specific question to make sure that we didn't create a new program. It's been in use since days after the earthquake struck. And again, I've had direct contact with my leadership down there on this topic.
Okay, well, we heard some things to the contrary when we were down there, and if you could just maybe reach back out again, particularly as relates to the
follow up.
earthquake. Yeah,
Yes, sir.
that'd be good. Also, the Chancellor of Germany said today she expects, according to her health experts, that 70% of the people in Germany will get the COVID-19, and there's really no reason that if that does happen in Germany, it's likely to happen here. And I'm just wondering what kind of disaster pre-planning, continuity for FEMA itself is being done now in anticipation that we might have a national disaster declaration. We certainly have a number of states already that have declared disasters.
Yes, sir. And if I can divide into a couple different buckets. So we are in support of HHS. They are the lead in this COVID-19 disease. And so we have, from the beginning, been providing interagency coordination, planning, analysis on a number of different things that we have a specialty in. So we've been in support from day one. I have about 30 people that work every day in support of HHS. When it comes to inside FEMA, I have 3 priorities that I've given the workforce from the beginning. Number 1 is preserve and protect the force. I need to protect my workforce because number 2, priority is be able to deliver my mission-critical missions in a degraded COVID-19 environment. So make sure we have enough people to execute our mission-essential functions. And then lastly, number 3 is support HHS and anything they need for their attack on squashing COVID-19 across the country. Those are the 3 priorities that we operate on today. We have members of the task force that are in consultation with them daily about what they need. And so it changes every day, it's fluid, it's dynamic, and I know the administration is looking at all tools at their disposal to battle COVID-19.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Now I recognize Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Administrator, thank you for being here. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you again. And as I told you last time, I'm not sure how many people I'd wish that job on. That's a tough job that you've stepped into, and you've inherited an awful lot of disasters that are going on, as the ranking member noted earlier. I want to flag a few things for you. Number 1, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act that became law in 2018 and bipartisan bill that many members in this committee worked on. It had a provision in there related to rebuilding of schools and other public facilities. There's in the Stafford Act, it says that each facility that floods is to have a $500,000 deductible. The way that FEMA has applied that is they have applied that $500,000 facility, which I view as being in a school. They've applied it to a storage shed, they've applied it to a gymnasium, they've applied it to the elementary school building, they've applied it to the middle school building, they've applied it to the high school building, they've applied it to the cafeteria. So all of a sudden, what would have been a $500,000 payment that I think Congress intended in Stafford has become, who knows, an $8 million payment. Many of our schools get their funds from property taxes. Properties have been destroyed during the flood, so you can just see this whole cascading effect. So in that bill, Congress enacted a change that made it clear it was $500,000 per facility, period, for a school, for a jail, whatever it is. That was law over a year ago. We have schools that still have not been rebuilt from our August 2016 flood because FEMA has not changed their rules. They have not implemented this law that was put in place over a year ago. So we have children that are being affected. We have schools that are doubling up. We have temporary buildings. We have schools that are literally in the same shape they were in before because they can't afford to rebuild them because they can't afford the deductible. Could you please make this a priority and fix this? The law is crystal clear. I think the law was clear before. Now it's even more clear, if that's possible. Would you please make this a priority and get this fixed as soon as possible?
Yes, sir. And I'll look into the specifics of how we have applied it in actual, right down to the local and county and state level. I don't know enough detail about how we're actually applying it, but you have my commitment that I'll get you feedback, and we'll compare what the law says and how we're applying it, and we'll work towards making
Thank
sure
you.
that we...
Administrator, I
of the law.
don't think there's any argument over what the law says. Actually, Congress has stepped in and done the same thing in the past for past disasters whenever FEMA has applied, and again, in my opinion, inappropriately applied Stafford. So there's nobody who should be reinventing the wheel. You can cut and paste what you've done in the past and just apply it here. Second issue, just because I'm burning time here, second issue, we also included a provision in there that I think was very well thought out, bipartisan support, that says that FEMA should get together with the Federal Highway Administration and develop standards for evacuation routes. And the reason is because in the event of disasters, we have found that many of our evacuation routes are inundated or otherwise impassable. Now you think about that for a minute. If our evacuation routes are impassable, that's a big deal. In our August 2016 flood, the interstate barrier between the east and west lane actually served as a levee. We needed levees, not there, which exacerbated flooding to the tune of 6 and in some cases maybe as high as 8 feet higher inundation on the north side of the interstate. And so it actually created victims because the people couldn't get off the interstate. They were stuck on these little interstate islands. We had to fly helicopters to drop food and supplies to them. It was ridiculous. So we put a provision in and said, hey, get with Federal Highway Administration, develop the right standards. Nothing has been changed on this interstate, nothing. Would you please look into this and make this a priority? There was some very tenuous guidance that was issued that didn't even come close to hitting the mark on this. So would you please look into this and make sure that this works?
I will, sir.
All right, last question. I'm going to guess that if you did work and you didn't receive a paycheck for a couple of years, that would probably make it very difficult on you. I don't know if you're married, but your spouse, your family. We have contractors in Louisiana that have done work in the Virgin Islands. Look, I know we can point fingers at everybody. We can point fingers at the companies. We can point fingers at the USVI government. You can point fingers at me. I don't care. Administrator, this is not okay. You're losing your disaster response capabilities across the United States. You're going to be limited to having 2 big companies left. They're going to gouge you on prices. This is not in your interest. Would you please step in and provide some leadership and address this? I yield back.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Holmes Norton for 5 minutes.
I very much appreciate this hearing, Madam Chair. Administrator Gaynor, I looked at your strategic plan. It covers 4 years. I looked at your so-called Publication 1. You call it a capstone document. Given the extreme weather, and some of it has been discussed here, and they, of course, amount to floods and fires and hurricanes and earthquakes, there was no mention of the climate change that may be the cause of these increases and this seriousness. So I need to know whether you recognize what is happening across the country and across the world as significantly different from what FEMA has experienced before, and that climate change is real. Yes, sir.
Yes, ma'am. Just to be clear on Pub 1, Pub 1 is really focused on the people of FEMA, and that's kind of the purpose of that document. So when it comes to climate change, we are at FEMA committed to respond to any disaster, no matter the cause. But that doesn't say we don't embrace a changing climate. We look at every mitigation plan in the United States at the state level is required to address changing conditions. They need to change the extreme environment. They need to address infrastructure. They need to address demographics to make sure that we address it. You can look at the past 75, 80 years, and I'll just pick hurricanes. They are more frequent, they're more intense, they're more costly, they're more deadly, and we understand that. And from my role here at FEMA, and this is the same concept I've had as a local and a state, we embrace all of those things. And I'm not going to argue with the science of it. My real job is to make sure that the nation, I'm prepared to deliver those disaster resources to the nation, no matter of the cause. And so I'm going to get graded on my response to a disaster, and you can name any one of them, and that's what we're focused on. However, we embrace all of those things to make sure that we have good planning, that we invest in pre-disaster mitigation. We realize that we cannot sustain the cost of disasters like we've seen in 2017 and 18. We need, and again, I thank Congress for passing the DRRA that allowed us to set aside 6% of disaster costs for pre-disaster mitigation. That changes the dynamic in the country, saying that we're going to invest in pre-disaster mitigation before disaster happens. That's my tool to address some of those concerns that you have.
Well, your answer is important because obviously what we're experiencing today is a difference in quality and in quantity of what we have ever experienced. So you are going to be the capstone agency. There's no way to get around who the nation will look to. So I appreciate what you've said. Now, the nation's capital, which I represent, is located on two rivers, the Anacostia and the Potomac, and has experienced very severe flooding. I mean flooding even on our main avenues where the archives are, where the most important businesses are. I'm very pleased in your testimony, while you didn't mention the word climate change, you did talk about resistant infrastructure. You did talk about catastrophic flooding. What is FEMA doing to prepare for urban flooding, where you may have whole cities underwater, or important parts of cities like the nation's capital? What is FEMA doing to prepare for that kind of catastrophe that could face not only the nation's capital, but many other cities which are located on the banks of cities?
Yes, ma'am.
Or rivers?
I think we're addressing all kinds of flooding. So I think when people think of flooding, they think of a hurricane and Houston that floods. But again, in my opening statement, 98% of the counties in America have flooded. So it's just not coastal communities; it's any community that really.
Is that new? That virtually every community has flooding? Is that new in the United States?
I think over time, that's we kind of say laughingly that if it rains, it floods. So, and again, just because you're not on the coast doesn't mean that you won't flood. And so one of the things we ask individuals, homeowners, is assess your risk where you live. Are you at risk of flooding? And if you're at risk of flooding, do you have flood insurance? Again, it's the best defense against flooding. It will get you back to normal quicker than a FEMA individual assistance program where, again, the average in Hurricane Harvey was only about $6,000. I'd rather give you that check for $250,000 because you insured your home, and maybe another $250,000 because you insured the contents of your home. That's how we really want to make a difference in the United States is close that insurance gap so people are best protected. The FEMA headquarters is in a rented building in Washington, D.C. We're in a commercial building. Across the street from me is the education department. My building, because it's commercial, is insured. The building across the street from me is a federal building, which is not insured. So again, we really need to take a hard look at what we insure in America to include homes. And just as what are we doing to address local problems? I'd be happy to connect with the DC local emergency manager to see how they're doing it, because it really is, again, back to shared responsibility. They have a mission to make sure that in this certain specific case that they reduce or minimize flooding in Washington, D.C. So I'd be happy to connect both of you to see what they're doing in tangible terms to prevent that from happening.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We now recognize Ms. Gonzalez Colon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning to Mr. Gaynor. First of all, I want to say thank you for always answering my calls, my text regarding many of the issues regarding Puerto Rico and the three major disasters, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria, and now the earthquakes at the southwestern part of the island. So, I mean, for me, it's important every time we do have cases, as you may know, that you are always there. So I appreciate that. It's been a bit different. I was taking notes of Chairman DeFazio's comments in terms of the roundtable we got with the mayors in Puerto Rico when the TNI committee went there, as well as many other members of Congress. And many of them are still wondering when mayor approvals for start the permanent works mitigation projects are going to happen. Can we have the current rate of Maria projects, Hurricane Maria projects worksheets approval in terms of the municipalities and the state government? Do you have that information?
I just missed, are we talking about Maria or earthquake?
Maria.
And
Hurricane Maria, okay. Many of the mayors in Puerto Rico, the municipalities, are still asking when the major projects are going to be approved. So I'm asking if you do have a rate of approval of those major projects worksheets.
Again, I was down, I met with you and the governor, Puerto Rico, the staff of Core 3, and my leadership down there, Alex Amparo, on many of these topics. It is, and we met with mayors, as you well know, and part of our goal is to make sure, and there's many small projects that we want to get on the street. Our goal was to get 200 small projects a month approved. And we're last month, I think it was 211. It will grow, and those small projects directly impact the 78 municipalities on Puerto Rico. It will help those mayors show progress and recovery. We are committed to make sure that we keep that pipeline open and get those small projects into those communities where it will make a big difference. Not really big projects, but projects that make a difference in a small community anywhere in Puerto Rico. So again, it is one of the priorities of my priorities, and it's a priority of Mr. Amparo's to make sure that we deliver on what we said.
Thank you. And maybe not for now, but if you can submit the committee data regarding the approval and disbursement on emergency funds still pending, as well as approval for start of permanent work and mitigation projects pending. If we do have that rate of all the projects that are being approved, not just the small projects, but the major projects, because that is still one of the concerns. I do know that the new governor requested a change for the alternative procedure. My question is the new delivery model now full implemented on the island? Is that better in terms of taking cases more easily? New delivery model. I think you need to turn on your mic.
It's on. Oh.
Okay, perfect.
We are committed to that model. It works in Puerto Rico. It took, we didn't have it from the beginning. We kind of did it midstream, but I think now it shows results. And I always smile when a mayor knows the exact process in that. I think in Puerto Rico they call it the snake. That where their projects are, what phase they're in, and when they can expect it to again be a tangible result at the end of that process. It's been a long slug in Puerto Rico, and I get that. And recovery is never fast enough for disaster survivors, and it's not fast enough for us. I think we've made major headway in the past 6-8 months on policy, process, rules, and you'll see here shortly major projects be approved and on the street. We've done all the work, we've done all the scoping, we've settled on all the rules about how we're going to treat all these different sectors, or whether it's the electrical sector or health or education. All those rules have been agreed to, and now you'll see that model put out results, and I think that's what we're all looking for. And again, we are committed to the recovery in Puerto Rico.
Thank you. Do you see that happening before the third anniversary of Maria in September of this year? Major projects being expedited or beginning?
I do. You'll see, I think you'll see the first major projects shortly. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I recognize Representative Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Administrator Gaynor, the President's fiscal year 21 proposed budget cuts the disaster relief fund by over $12 million and almost 70% decrease from DRF's fiscal year 20 allocation. How would the proposed budget cut affect FEMA's ability to carry out a culture of preparedness, ready the nation for catastrophic disasters, and streamline the complexity of the agency?
Yes, sir. I think the cut is reflected in FEMA receiving a supplemental either in the budget year or the previous budget year that made us redo the math. Today, I have $42 billion in the DRF. We are healthy when it comes to having enough money to deal with all the disasters that are on the books and all the disasters or the next coming hurricane season. We have enough money in there to respond to and recover from a number of disasters that we're working on or a disaster that may beset us in the next year.
Thank you. Trump's budget also calls for a $163 million reduction to the flood hazard mapping and risk analysis program. Since flooding is the most common and most costly disaster to repair from, how would the agency plan to execute flooding mitigation plans in lieu of such drastic cuts?
Yes, sir. And again, I think the cut is just reflective of how much progress we have made on flood mapping. We have 100% of the most highest risk flood areas in the United States mapped. We have about a third of the entire catalog mapped of the United States. There's another third that are at low risk, areas that have no people in them or have no risk of flooding that would impact either facilities or individuals. We'll work through that, and then we have another third that we have to map. I think we have sufficient funding to do mapping over the next couple of years. We actually map about 20% a year, and so maps get refreshed every 5 years. So we do 20% of the catalog every year, and then every 5 years the entire catalog is updated.
Sure.
So we can always do more, but right now I think we've made good headway. We've digitized the majority of these maps today.
Well, is it your testimony that $163 million cut from the flood hazard mapping and risk analysis program would not hurt your efforts?
I think
Is that
part
your
of it is,
testimony?
I think for us it's a capacity issue. I think for the amount of work we have in front of us, the amount of people assigned to it, the amount that we have today is sufficient.
Well, let me ask you this question, sir, and thank you. As I know you, one of the most prevalent issues facing the agency currently is an understaffed workforce. In response to Chairwoman Titus's question, you stated that you seek to create a diverse, ethical, and integrated workforce. Can you expound on how you plan to achieve this objective and explain why you believe that a diverse workforce is important in enabling FEMA to accomplish its mission?
If I answer the last one first, because we need to reflect what the country looks like. And so having a diverse workforce is important to us. This past October, and one of the members referenced Pub 1, which is We Are FEMA. And it really is about who we are, what we do, how we deliver our services, and what we believe in. And so I have doubled down on our core values of compassion, integrity, respect, and fairness. That's how I want every employee to operate. If you use those core values to operate in sometimes a complex, difficult, challenging environment, you'll never make a wrong mistake or have a wrong solution. We need to invest more in our incident workforce. Today, I have enough personnel to respond to anything in the United States. We have a challenge on the recovery side. Again, I think Member Graves referenced 640 open disasters dating as far back as the year 2000. So there's a lot of open disasters. Last year, flooding was prevalent across the Midwest. About 70 brand new disasters last year. So we need to do a better job in again, telling people who we are so they want to join our ranks. Again, I believe I have the best mission in federal government, helping people before, during, and after disasters. I need to attract those kind of people to come to FEMA so I can deliver those services to the American people. We are working hard at it to make sure that we double down on how we recruit, where we recruit, and how we retain people. It is important to our mission. Can't do it without people, and that's the bottom line.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you. Now I recognize Mr. Palmer for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Administrator Gaynor, this is an issue that I'd brought up, I think, on the Oversight Committee, and I want to revisit here about the FEMA trailers. And there was an Associated Press report from December 2017 that detailed FEMA's management of trailers leased to disaster victims, and noted that the federal government spends up to $150,000 for these mobile homes, which are used for about 18 months and then auctioned off for considerably less than what FEMA pays for them. Since this report initially came out, and I assume you're familiar with that report, has FEMA made any changes to, first of all, the process by which they procure these mobile homes? And they're not your fancier mobile homes to start with. That price seems rather high, but in your disposition of them afterwards.
Yes, sir. We are cognizant of the cost of all sorts of disaster supplies or material.
I've only got a little bit of time, so I want to really drill down on this. So what concerns me is I understand that there'd be some issues with storage or parking these things after you use them, but does it make sense to pay $150,000 for a housing unit and then auction it off for prices below $10,000?
So there's a certain cost of doing business in emergency management. So we buy supplies, we buy water, we buy food, we buy housing units to be ready. And in some cases, you may not have enough, and you have to go out to the market to buy more. And so sometimes you pay a premium. But our mission is to deliver.
I understand, but and I'm trying to help you. This is not just from a practical perspective that if you paid this for these mobile homes and they're used for 18 months, does it make sense to have an inventory, or does it make sense to go out and have to pay a premium for these when you could probably buy a more upscale unit for less? I'm trying to figure out if there's a way that we can manage this and not cost the taxpayer so much money.
Yes, sir. I think the root of this problem, I think, is post-disaster housing across the United States. So just not California or other places. Post-disaster housing is an issue. We are working with states and counties and locals to help improve post-disaster housing because it will minimize the use for these trailers and mobile housing units. I think for me, these are the last resort kinds of things that we want to implement.
Right.
I think no one wants to move into a travel trailer after living in a 2,000 square foot home. We want to put those disaster survivors in something.
That's not what I'm asking, and maybe I need to put this in writing. I'm just trying to figure out, does it make sense to pay $150,000 for a unit, use it one time for 18 months? Is it more, and then auction it off for less than $10,000? Does it make sense to inventory those, retrofit, refurbish them so that they can be used again? And first of all, so that you have some level of preparedness the next time you need some, instead of having gone out and pay these high prices. Also, in regard to debris removal, Alabama suffered a horrendous swarm of tornadoes on April 27, 2011. My hometown of Hackleburg, Alabama, the F5 was named the the Hackleburg tornado was wiped out. And FEMA's report said that there was about 10 million cubic feet of debris that was removed. Some of us think that it was a good bit more. And one of the things, before I was in Congress, I ran a think tank and I was looking at this. FEMA apparently, it almost looked like a single source bid for debris removal. It was about $40 per cubic yard. When I know some of the counties refused to go along with that bid, the state has to pay, I think, about 25% of that cost. And they were doing it for $10 to $15 a cubic foot. If your estimate of 10 million cubic feet is correct, that would have been $400 million. 100 million of that would have come from the states. When you do debris removal, do you have multiple companies that you go out for bid for, or is there one or two companies that you rely on all the time?
So we don't do debris removal.
I know you bid it out.
No, we reimburse for debris removal.
Correct.
So the contract for debris removal, and if we just want to keep it simple from a state point of view, the contract is between the state and the contractors or the vendors that they hire. So they have to follow federal procurement laws to make sure that they do it correctly. They make sure that it's eligible and reasonable costs, and only then do we reimburse. But we have no contract between debris removal vendors. That is strictly between, in this case, the state and the vendors that they select.
Is the Army Corps of Engineers involved in this process? Someone gave them this contractor and led many of them to believe that they needed to go this route at $40 a cubic yard when I know for a fact that they were, the counties who refused to do that were getting it done for $10 to $15 a cubic yard. So that may not be something that you've looked into, but you know, we keep looking at all these disasters and Madam Chairman, the cost keeps going up and up and up, and I'm all for getting in there and helping people. I really am, but I think we need to maximize every dollar to get it to the people that need it, and also the tremendous burden that's imposed on states. We need to be aware of that because it's not just the federal government, it's the states as well. I appreciate your indulgence, and I yield back.
Now I recognize Mr. Garamendi for 5 minutes.
Thank you. The gentleman is quite correct. It is the regulations that basically require the hiring of a company that has previously done it. In California, in one of the fires, it was a Tennessee company that came all the way to California to do it at a very, very high cost. And this does need to be looked into. Thank you for raising that question, and we'll follow through. Administrator Gaynor, thank you for being here and taking all of these questions. We've heard from many communities in my area that the financial recovery projects, the permanent work, they cannot afford the upfront cost. Waiting for reimbursement from FEMA is just an impossible situation. Often they just let it go. The 2013 Sandy Recovery Act, Congress established the so-called Section 428 alternative procedures under FEMA's Public Assistance Program, allowing your agency to fund major disaster recovery projects, so-called permanent work up front, in exchange for the state accepting a binding cost estimate for the project. However, many localities facing these cash flow problems following disasters do not participate in the Section 428 alternative procedures. My question to you, does FEMA agree that Section 428 is underutilized by the states, and why might that be the case?
Yes, sir. Well, it's not mandatory, I think, is the first case. It's not mandatory that you use it. However, we champion 428 wherever we go. And it is a better way to do business. And it really is a difference between 428 agreeing on a fixed cost, and the traditional way is actual costs. And I'll give you an example. There's a disaster in the South that we're still working on, and it's from Katrina. It's 14 years old. It's still open. I'm still paying on actual costs because with actual costs, there's no incentive to actually close a disaster or speed the project, right? Because the federal government will pay the entire bill on that. 428 is fixed costs, where, like building a house, you agree on the cost of that house, And if it runs over, then, and again, I just use the state is on the hook for that overage. But if it's under, you get to use that money for other projects. And I think that, and again, that's a great incentive to speed recovery and to save taxpayer dollars.
You have that right, and by raising the issue of a cost, you and I had this discussion beforehand. If we were to move more aggressively in this and you had a cost estimate up front, it was agreed that that would be the cost the county or the state would then proceed. That then would allow the FEMA to make periodic payments. For example, when the contract was signed, 10%, and then when some of the work was done, periodic payments, and at the end, you do the audit and get it done. I really would urge you to move in that direction and provide for these periodic upfront costs. It might be better for everybody, and your 14 years at FEMA, at Katrina, would not happen again. So please give that your consideration, and we'll work with you to accomplish that. And by the way, I have a piece of legislation that would urge you to do it even more, and that's HR 6071. Write that one down. We're coming to you to get it done. Wildfire mitigation, a clarification on it. Presently, you can relocate buildings that are in a hazard area. Would you please confirm that FEMA's current interpretation of the federal regulation that allows you to do this, to relocate destroyed facilities due to the risk of wildfire or other hazards, not just floods? Presently, you seem to be focused on floods and not applying this relocation alternative to fires. Tell me that's not the case.
I'm not going to give you a definitive answer because I would have to go research it. But I think when you think about mitigation, we would not want to, just in a general sense, rebuild in the same place, the same structure as we previously had. So, 428 combined with mitigation, I think we want to build smarter, build up to current code standards, and look at the environment that we're building in. So, I owe you an answer about how we apply that when it comes to wildfire.
Yeah. I'll look forward to your responses to both of these over time. Thank you for your work.
Thank you. We now recognize Ms. Rehearsal-Powell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for having this hearing. Congratulations on the appointment, Mr. Gaynor. I want to start just by asking you if you recall a letter that I sent to you in July that deals specifically with flood insurance. I wanted to get information on National Flood Insurance Program and FEMA's new initiative of Risk Grading 2.0. I express my strong concerns that FEMA's new risk pricing model that is being developed currently is not fairly being communicated with local municipalities and being transparent to the public. And I did ask several questions, and you've mentioned that everyone should be under a flood insurance plan. And one of my questions is, what steps are you taking to ensure that all homeowners with a federally backed mortgage are enrolled in flood insurance? So I want to know, I've been waiting for months if you recall the letter and if you have any answers to those questions.
I can't say that I personally have seen that letter. What's the date on it?
It was directed to you, July 11th, 2019.
I will, it seems overdue to me. We try to get back pretty quickly on
I
some
would
letters from
appreciate
members.
that.
I will look into that.
Thank you.
And we took a pause on rates because we want to make sure we did it right. Because there's lots of sensitivity across the nation about, the premium and against risk.
Exactly.
We want to make sure that.
Which is why I think it's important to be communicating with the local communities, because they're extremely concerned and they want to understand what process you are following as you establish the new 2.0 risk rating plan.
Yes, ma'am. And again, this hasn't been updated since the 1970s, and we're eager to actually, move this along so it actually reflects risk.
Thank you, Mr. Gaynor. Now, you were talking about making sure that people have flood insurance. And just to give you an idea, most people assume that people that are living in coastal communities are extremely wealthy, and that's not the case. We have hardworking Americans living in my district, along the Keys, and also in Miami-Dade County. And in the Keys, their average annual premium is $2,278 a year, so much higher than what you stated of $700 a year. And it's definitely a concern as you start developing the premiums under the risk rating 2.0. So I wanted to ask you, what steps are you taking right now to ensure affordability under this new plan that you're formulating?
Yes, ma'am. Again, it goes back to risk, and I'll try to keep it simple. So if you live on the water, you would assume that you probably have the highest risk of something bad happening to your home. If you live right on, the beach and the ocean is right there, you probably have the highest risk. Some of our maps don't reflect that in a really elegant way. We have these hard-drawn lines where once you go over a certain line, the risk really drops off a cliff, and that's not reasonable. And so we want to make sure that if you have the highest risk, you should probably pay the highest premium, and then as you work your way to less riskier locations, that you have lower premiums. And again, our maps don't help us get there, but one of our goals is to make those maps graduated. So it really reflects reality. We're looking at what's it cost to rebuild a house.
That's good to hear. Mr. Gaynor, I'm going to cut you off because I have so many questions. Thank you so much. We definitely have to meet after this hearing to discuss that issue more. But also, you're saying that you have enough money, that you're not really concerned. We had Hurricane Irma back in 2017. It's going to be almost 3 years this summer, and we're still waiting to get the reimbursements for my community. Just to give you an idea, the city of Key West is still waiting on $3 million to be obligated. City of Homestead waiting on nearly $12 million. Florida City, $4 million. Miami-Dade County alone is waiting for over $100 million. While I thank you for the funding that we have received after my request, I just need to hear from you that we're going to be receiving those reimbursements quickly because we're now entering another hurricane season. This was a hurricane category 4. Scientists are talking about categories 5, 6, and higher. And I'm very concerned that we're not prepared, once again, and we haven't even gotten those reimbursements.
Yes, ma'am. If my staff will connect with you and specifically what reimbursements are you waiting for, but typically we reimburse the state, and the state actually does all the validation of the projects, making sure again they're eligible, making sure they're reasonable, make sure all the documentation is there, and then
we haven't gotten the state hasn't received those funds yet. So it's still sitting at FEMA. Because my 5 minutes are up, and I'm very concerned that we are not following all the appropriate procedures and policies in all the different federal agencies to prepare for coronavirus. And so I want to ask specifically, what conversations have you personally had with the Secretary of Health and Human Services as we are entering into this outbreak here in the United States?
Yes, ma'am. I have personally not had any conversations.
You have not had a seat at the table in these, you have not been at the table discussing what you need to do for emergency response?
The Secretary of Homeland Security and his deputy have been at the table on the task force. We are in support of HHS, so at the staff level, that's where my focus is right now, and making sure that I support the Secretary and all the things that he needs support from. So again, interagency coordination, planning, analysis, all those things that we're really good at, we're supporting him right now.
And you have all the supplies you need to provide assistance to areas that would be hit by this outbreak from one day to the next. Are you ready?
So when you say supplies, what do you mean? What do you mean?
Beds, tents, food, water.
So we have warehouses across the country with all sorts of commodities for all sorts of, it's an all hazard approach. So we have commodities from coast to coast. We have commodities on Puerto Rico. We have
You're ready?
On
Do you
Hawaii.
feel ready?
We are ready every day.
Is FEMA ready?
FEMA is ready every day because every day.
That's what I want to hear.
And the simplest term is earthquake day, right? It could happen tomorrow. So we are ready. We're ready to support HHS, who is in the lead for the COVID-19. And until that changes, we'll remain in support.
Thank you, Mr. Gaynor.
Welcome.
Thank you. We now recognize Ms. Fletcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus. Thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you, Administrator Gaynor, for being here and taking the time to testify today. You have already touched in your testimony a little bit about the area I represent and some of the complications we saw after Hurricane Harvey. I represent Texas's 7th Congressional District in Houston, and my district had some of the most affected areas during Harvey and in the response. And I know from that experience and from being here that FEMA personnel are stretched thin, are managing responses across the country, especially during Harvey. We had wildfires, we had other hurricanes. It was a tremendous effort, and we know that we ask the agency to do a lot and often with limited resources, and appreciate the good work that FEMA did in our community and across the country. That said, I think that most of us on this committee still see room for improvement, as I think you do as well, in how we respond to natural disasters. And often the recovery is just slower than we need it to be. In our experience, and I kind of want to touch on some of the things my constituents have told me were particular challenges for them, because what I would like to see, and I think the purpose of this hearing is to talk about ways we can improve and streamline disaster response. And we've already done legislation that's gone through this committee to try to help with some of the challenges that we have seen. But the greatest concern that I hear from my constituents is that we just haven't made enough progress in preparing for future storms, and that there is a lot of confusing process in the disaster recovery process. So I'm hopeful that implementation of DURA will lead to more resilient communities and processes before catastrophic events happen. But I would like you to touch on a couple things, and I've only got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to put them out there, and if you can address these, that would be great. One, can you talk a little bit about how FEMA plans to incentivize investments and reduce risk from a pre-disaster perspective? And right now, the other thing that really seems to be a challenge to me that we're working on, and I'd love your perspective on, the disaster response and disaster preparedness are currently split between a variety of agencies. I wrote down earlier, you said 19 agencies and 90 different disaster programs. So that is often incredibly confusing for the disaster victims who are trying to navigate it, often with limited resources after a storm. So what do you see as the largest gaps when it comes to communicating and coordinating with those agencies, whether it's the SBA or HUD or even the Army Corps following a disaster? And what tools do you need that you currently lack to close some of those gaps? What can we provide that could help close those gaps? If you could just address kind of that general topic for the next couple minutes, that'd be great.
Yes, ma'am. So the first question about how do we incentivize better behavior, I guess, when it comes to being prepared. And I'll go back to what I touched on before, is investment in pre-disaster mitigation. We have had a number of catastrophic disasters since 2017 and 18. It's bad, but it can be worse, and we hope that never happens. But I think the passage of DURA allowed us to set aside 6% of all disaster costs to do pre-disaster investment in pre-disaster mitigation. That is a game changer in my point of view, that we're going to actually take money before a disaster happens and invest that in making our infrastructure more resilient. And the money in the new program, BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, is aimed at community lifelines. These are 7 community lifelines that, if any of these are interrupted, like telecommunications, energy, if any of those are interrupted, life changes in that community. And so can we invest this money, this pre-disaster money, in making those things more resilient? So when a disaster happens, we bend, but we don't break, and we snap back to some better result if we had not invested in pre-disaster. So that's the best thing that we've done locally, but that's just not a federal responsibility. That's a shared responsibility.
Sure.
So I would encourage locals and states and counties and tribes and territories to invest in their own pre-disaster mitigation programs, because again, this whole thing works best when locals and states and tribes, territories all work together.
Sure, and I think that goes to the coordination point. So with the time we have left, can you talk a little bit about coordinating among the federal agencies and helping victims get the help they need?
If I think about coordination today, I think about Puerto Rico and the big disaster and many different full-time federal agencies down there working together, combining all their resources together to drive at outcome-driven recovery, right? Not just using FEMA money for a certain project and using HUD money for a certain project, but trying to figure out how do we leverage all this great federal money and opportunity into a better outcome. We're doing it in Puerto Rico. We're doing it in other places across the country. We need to be better at it. One is we're working with HUD to how do we close the gap on temporary housing repairs and permanent housing repairs. that time in between is too long. It's not fully integrated, and we want to change that. So any help on any of those topics, I would enjoy help in making it less complex and speed recovery.
Okay, well, thank you. I see that I've gone over my time, so I encourage you to continue to coordinate, and I really encourage you to look at the experience of recovery from the perspective of the disaster victim and trying to help that coordination, and we're going to do what we can to try to help that as well. Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thank you. We now recognize Mr. LaMalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to help keep you company here in the committee today. And thanks for Administrator Gaynor for appearing in front of us. First of all, I want to say thanks, heartfelt thanks to how much help FEMA has been in Northern California over 3 different disasters in the last 3 years, really, starting with the Oroville Dam spillway situation, which could have been a lot worse, but indeed required an amazing amount of cleanup and restoration of the infrastructure there. Then the Carr Fire west of Redding, California in the north, and the Camp Fires we know from the Paradise area in Northern California. So you've been extremely helpful on that. Just a few nuances I'm going to go over with you on how some of the things can be executed. So going to the Carr Fire situation, which a lot of that happened on the Whiskeytown National Recreation Area, a park west of Redding, and a particular lake there called Rainbow Lake nearby. And the particular issue I'm talking about is something called the Misselbeck Dam that is, the issues there start with the fire that wiped out so much vegetation on the national park there, and the debris that subsequently, with the record rainfall we had, which in itself was a disaster, some of the effects of the rain was a disaster, swept much sediment into the lake and the outlets there that would help to keep the lake level. The pipes and devices there to keep the lake level as they see fit. A lot of sediment there. It had been fairly well maintained, but was overwhelmed by all this here. So FEMA was asked if they could help with the clearing of some of that silt and sediment in order to make those functional. And my understanding is on 2 different occasions they've denied that application for the assistance from the 2019 rainstorm subsequent to the fire, claiming that they didn't have the information on the sediment levels before the disaster and that maintenance has been done. So what we do have is information from our state experts at CAL FIRE, who a lot of times work hand in hand with, about the conditions that were there of the maintenance of the project, the maintenance of those drains and such. So my question is, why does FEMA disagree with local experts on that, state experts on that? And then how would a small community service district, like is up there in the place called Igo and Ono, how in the world would they ever be able to take care of all that sediment after a fire, being a small district? And so I'll stop there and see what do you think of those thoughts? And then there's also a question on a 60-day period after a disaster too. But how would a local district do that? Why would FEMA disagree with the assessment by the state CAL FIRE organization?
Yes, sir. I do not know the specifics of that particular project or that particular issue. I'd be happy to get with my staff, get with Bob Fenton, who's the
I've worked with them.
regional administrator, and look into that and give you and your staff feedback about decision-making, and I'd be happy to speed that along and get it done here in the next couple of days.
I appreciate that, because again, it's very important. There's really no way the local service district could do that. And you could have a situation where the dam, I mean, I guess we're lucky in a way we've had almost a drought this year, but the dam could overtop with the inability to regulate the flow that way. So also on the Whiskeytown and the Carr Fire situation, there was a private contract, or a private site had been cleared around there for tree and debris and such. And they had a contractor do that, but there was also nearby a public building, a public facility, which is a police station and a park ranger's office, also very important to that operation. FEMA would now have to send, they only did the work on the private building, they would now have to send a second contractor a second time to do cleanup on a public site rather than one that when they were there 40 yards away doing a private facility. why wouldn't they do all in one when they have the opportunity, when they see, especially since it's a public building right nearby? Why would they not do that?
Again, sir, I mean, I don't know the details, but I'd be happy to get back to you on some of that decision-making.
Okay, because that would be a cost-saving measure and a time-saving one as well, so, because they end up doing both. Okay, lastly, when we're looking at fire disasters, it doesn't appear that FEMA has been quite as geared towards dealing with, forest fire disasters, wildfire, as maybe they're unfortunately versed on hurricanes and floods and things of that nature. So standing burnt trees, they're still standing but will be a hazard. In my view, they should be counted as a debris that would be in an area that FEMA should be looking really hard at. Delayed damage from sediment, as we talked about with the car fire in Reading into Whiskeytown and then into the watersheds around the campfire in Reading, should be looked at more closely too. Now, I do got to give you kudos for the clearing that was done in Reading, at the Paradise, Magalia, and the Concow areas up there on clearing out the lots where buildings had burned down, and there's a lot of toxic material in a footprint of a building. So FEMA made the decision to do that just because it was important, so, and pay for 90% of it. So that was very important and much appreciated by the community there. But other sediment issues and other issues having to do with wildfire recovery, I would just ask FEMA to work with us more on having a more definition on how you deal with post-wildfire disaster problems in it, other than, unfortunately, especially lately, has been a lot of hurricane, a lot of flood too. So anyway, and I say that with all appreciation for the efforts you've made in the area, and I know you have a lot to worry about. You're stretched pretty thin, but these are just things I think we can fine tune, and would love to have that opportunity to work with you more on that, okay?
Yes, sir, we'll get back to you on all those things.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Apparently, while you've been sitting here, Mr. Administrator, your Atlanta office has found evidence of someone exposed to coronavirus and has closed down for 2 weeks with people teleworking, waiting to hear for more guidance from HHS. Have you gotten any word about that?
Yes, ma'am. So late last night, this is a suspected case of coronavirus. No test results back yet. But an abundance of caution, back to my priorities to preserve the force. It really coincided with what we're doing today across the agency. We're actually doing a agency-wide connectivity telework drill today. So fortunately, it fell into that. So most employees were either going to telework today or work from alternate locations. And again, we want to make sure that I preserve the force so I can deliver those mission-essential functions. So it happened in Region 4 today. It's going to happen in other locations across the country. It's going to happen here in Washington, D.C. And my staff and I have been working to make sure that we have a balanced response to some of these challenges we're going to have. Again, fluid, dynamic. The first instance is not like the second instance. And so this is, again, I have my leadership working on it right now to make sure we adapt to the changing circumstances and we make good decisions.
Thank you. Ms. Plaskett, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Mr. Gaynor, for being here. Of course, thank you for your service before coming to FEMA, and I know you have an incredible task on your hand. So many people relying on your agency immediately after storms, after disasters, and that's a heavy burden I know that you have. But I think you're very able for the job, and we're grateful to have you there. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. One was about, first, I understand now that the Virgin Islands has been put under a federal coordinator that is working with Puerto Rico. Can you tell me what was the reason for, because initially we were told that we would not have a federal coordinator, that we were doing things appropriately, and now we have a federal coordinator underneath Puerto Rico. And while my sister, Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon, knows that, I love Puerto Rico, they're our nearest neighbor, they are a behemoth in comparison to us and can suck a lot of resources and attention that we would otherwise have gotten.
Yes, ma'am. So I had visited both Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands. I went down to the U.S. Virgin
We're America's paradise. They're Puerto Rico, the land of
yes, ma'am.
sun.
I don't want to
we're
get
the
into
paradise.
that argument. I go around the country to see how disaster recovery is progressing. When it came to the U.S. Virgin Islands, I had many discussions with the governor and his staff, Adrian Williams from Director of Recovery, about the speed of recovery, and I wasn't satisfied that it was going fast enough. And I have a deep bench when it comes to federal coordinating offices, and one of my top FCOs is Bill Vogel. He was down there right after Maria.
Sure.
And
And he's back now.
he's back
We're
now.
happy to have him there.
And he's doing tremendous. And we made some really great headway. We were held up on education, trying to move
Sure.
education in schools, get kids back in schools. We've moved that along in a big way. And again, it's about leadership, and it's about making sure we have the focus on it.
So why don't we have our own federal coordinator and not sit underneath Puerto Rico if your bench is in fact deep?
Because I think Mr. Amparo, who's in charge of recovery for Puerto Rico, is also trying to deal with earthquake. And I think, just again, we weren't expecting the earthquake.
Sure.
And so I think he's stretching a lot of different ways, both in Maria recovery and now as we proceed in the earthquake recovery. It's prudent, I think, a prudent leadership move to move Mr. Vogel to
And so
USVI.
he would be considered our federal coordinator, not underneath Puerto Rico, but reporting directly to Washington?
Oh, no, I think there's an administrative report to Mr. Amparo for the Caribbean.
So I guess my question is, if Mr. Umpire is caught up with Puerto Rico and its massive, not only hurricane recovery and rebuilding, but also earthquake, why not have Bill Vogel be a federal coordinator for the Virgin Islands and report directly to you? Or to whomever in...
I mean, I think typically the way it works across the country is the FCOs report to the regional administrator. So Mr. Von Essen out of Region 2 in New York City, he's the one that coordinates all those things at the region. So that's typically the way we do it across the country.
Okay, well, you talked about schools just a moment ago, and one of the issues that we have now with a school that we had a mobile unit placed on the island of St. Croix, where I live in Frederickstead, the Arthur Richards Middle School, which was completely destroyed, has now a Sprung Center, a mobile unit. We also have an elementary school, Alexander Henderson School there. There are massive odors coming from there, and the school has had to be shut down. I don't know if you're aware of this. The builder of that school, AECOM, has said that it's not under warranty anymore and they have no responsibility. Although the complaints were initially told to them well before the warranty was out. Can I get your support in having some discussion with AECOM to address this issue? Our children, our teachers have had to leave the school for periods of time, days at a time, because of this, and it's very concerning.
So I will talk to the governor or Ms. Williams about their contract with AECOM.
Great.
And I'll do that this week.
Great, thank you. I know the legislature, our local legislature, is very concerned about this. The other thing I wanted to talk about, I'm almost running out of time, is with regard to fixed cost estimates. You know that March 20th is the deadline when we have to have all of our fixed cost estimates in place for all projects funded through the alternative procedures in the Virgin Islands. If the March 20th deadline is not met and is not extended by FEMA, the consequences may be significant. Projects in the Virgin Islands that are not funded through the Alternative Procedures Program cannot take advantage of the unique assistance provided to the islands by Congress. That March 20th deadline is right around the corner. How many projects do you know have been completed by the Virgin Islands, and how many are outstanding?
I don't know. I try to stay out of that, the FCO's
Okay, well, I
business.
can tell you that over 300 projects have not been completed as yet, and that March 20th deadline is coming. I understand from the Virgin Islands that they're working on submitting a request for an extension. Can you explain to us or understand what is causing the delay in this, and because of that, will an extension be granted?
So I don't know of the specifics of the delay. We believe that deadlines drive progress, and so we try to keep to those deadlines as much as possible. We try to work with our partners on USVI and other partners across the country on making sure that we drive recovery as hard as we can. I'll look into what is the major holdup. Again, we work with our partners because this is a partnership between the federal government, the territory, and our other partners, making sure we move recovery along as fast as possible. I'll look into the issues and get back.
Well, I'm sure you'll be getting a letter from the governor because there's no way that we're going to meet that March 20th deadline when my understanding is that maybe we have a couple dozen projects, fixed cost projects done. I know that there's limited availability of local resources, unique structural changes that need to be done in the Virgin Islands. This is a new standard that we're giving to Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico to build as it should be as opposed to as is. Right. But I do not want the territory shortchanged on this game changer for us in terms of becoming more resilient through the funding that Congress has had. And it would be imperative for you to extend that deadline for us to meet these projects.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for your indulgence, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Administrator, I just have one last question before we close. I mentioned this in my opening statement that there's supposed to be 3 of you, the administrator and 2 deputy administrators. We don't have 2 deputy administrators, but you've recently created what's called a chief operating officer. And if you look at the description of that position, it's the same as a deputy administrator. And we're just wondering if you did this to try to get around the Senate approval process or what your thinking is.
Yes, ma'am. No, I did not try to do this to get around the Senate. You know, for me, it's a practical solution, and the practical solution is picking the right people for the right job, for the right place, and try to keep the train moving in the right direction. We will work with the administration on identifying nominees, but until then, Ms. Coleman, who's the Chief Operating Officer, will kind of drive the internal bus of FEMA, all the things that are important to people, IT solutions, procurement, all those things that are how we run a efficient business. And when the administration makes a nomination and that person gets confirmed, that COO position will sunset. But for me right now, it's about keeping stability, making sure I select the very best people that I have in FEMA. I have some wildly talented people, both politicals and career. And in this case, this is a decision to make sure that we keep moving forward on all the things that are important to FEMA and all the things that are important to the nation.
Well, I appreciate that, but you're responsible for the continuity of government. We just don't want you setting a bad example that now other agencies follow as an attempt to short-circuit the process.
I try to set a good example every day.
We appreciate that. Well, thank you very much for spending your morning with us. I think you answered some questions, allayed some fears, and promised to coordinate with us both on individual projects and bigger reform issues like recruitment and retention. So thank you very much. Are there any further questions from members of the committee? Seeing none, I'd like to thank you again for your testimony, and I'd ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witness has provided answers to any questions that may be submitted in writing. I ask unanimous consent that the record also remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or the witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. If no other members have anything to say, the subcommittee stands adjourned.